If a message is perfect, it should be clear, not deep, not open to interpretation, not something that needs experts, scholars, and centuries of debate to figure out. Clear. Because that's what perfection looks like in communication. If I give you directions to my house and you end up in 3 different cities, depending on how you interpret my words, you wouldn't call my directions perfect. You'd call them confusing or just bad. Now, apply that same basic standard to religious messages that claim to come from an all-knowing, all-powerful source. Suddenly, the rules change. Now confusion becomes depth, disagreement becomes mystery, and contradictions become interpretation. That's convenient. Let's slow this down and look at the core claim. Many religions say their message is perfect, not just good, not just meaningful, perfect. A perfect message from a perfect being. But then we look at reality, thousands of denominations, different interpretations of the same text, people reading the same words and coming to completely opposite conclusions. Some see peace, others justify violence. Some see strict rules, others see symbolic meaning. Some say, this is literal, others say, this is metaphor. And everyone thinks they're right. So the obvious question is this: if the message is perfect, why is the understanding so broken? Think about something simple. Traffic lights, red means stop, green means go. No debate, no interpretation, no confusion. You don't get philosophers arguing whether red really means stop or if it's just symbolic. Why? Because the message is clear. It's designed to be understood the same way by everyone. Now compare that to religious texts. One verse says something, another verse seems to say something else. One group reads it one way, another group reads it completely differently. And instead of questioning the message, people blame the reader. You misunderstood it. But if millions of people misunderstand the same message in different ways, at what point do we question the message itself? Because a perfect communicator wouldn't design a message that depends on perfect interpretation. That's not how communication works. Now let's make this more real. Take Christianity. You have Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, and hundreds of smaller groups. They all use the same core text, but they disagree on major things: salvation, authority, rituals, even basic beliefs about what God wants. Some believe faith alone saves you, others say faith plus works. Some pray to saints, others say that's wrong. Same book, different conclusions. Now move to Islam. You have different schools of thought, different interpretations of law, theology, and practice. Even within the same tradition, people argue over what the text really means. Some take things literally, others say context matters. Again, same source, different meanings. Now look at Hinduism, a massive range of beliefs. Some see many gods, some see one ultimate reality. Some focus on rituals, others focus on philosophy. Texts that are interpreted in completely different ways, depending on the tradition. So, this isn't a one religion problem, it's a pattern. Different religions, same issue. A message that claims clarity, but produces confusion. And here's where things get interesting. Believers often respond with this idea: the message is perfect, humans are flawed. Sounds reasonable at first. But think about it. If you know your audience is flawed and you're perfect, then you should design your message to work, despite those flaws. That's what good communication does. A teacher doesn't blame students for misunderstanding unclear instructions. A good teacher simplifies, explains better, uses examples, removes ambiguity. Now imagine a perfect teacher. There would be no confusion, not because students are perfect, but because the explanation is. So, when a message constantly leads to confusion, disagreement, and division, blaming humans starts to sound like an excuse, especially when the sender is supposed to be perfect. Let's bring this into everyday life. Imagine a company releases a product manual. Millions of users read it. Half of them use the product one way. The other half uses it completely differently. Some even damage the product because of how they understood the instructions. Would the company say, "Our manual is perfect, the users are flawed"? No. They would rewrite the manual, because clarity is the responsibility of the one sending the message. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. Religious texts don't get rewritten for clarity. Instead, interpretations multiply, commentaries grow, scholars argue, and ordinary people are told to trust the correct interpretation. But who decides what's correct? usually the group you already belong to. So, truth becomes something you inherit, not something that is clearly delivered. That's not what a perfect message should look like. A perfect message shouldn't need layers of explanation just to be understood. It shouldn't require historical context, linguistic analysis, and expert guidance just to avoid misunderstanding basic ideas. Because then it's not clear, it's dependent. And once a message depends on interpretation, it stops being stable. It becomes flexible, and flexible messages can be shaped to fit almost anything. That's why the same text can be used to justify kindness and cruelty, peace and conflict, freedom and control. It all depends on how you read it. And if that's the case, then the power isn't in the message, it's in the interpretation. Which raises another question. If the meaning can change depending on who reads it, can we really call the message perfect? Or is it just vague enough to survive any interpretation? Because there's a big difference between something being deep and something being unclear, and calling confusion depth doesn't actually solve the problem, it just hides it. And once you start noticing this pattern, it becomes harder to ignore, because the issue isn't just disagreement, it's the scale of disagreement across cultures, across time, across entire civilizations, all reading what they believe is a perfect message, and somehow still not agreeing on what it actually says. Now, let's push this further, because this is where people usually try to escape the problem. They say, the message is clear, but only if you understand the context. That sounds smart. It feels like a solution. But it actually makes the problem worse, because now the message isn't just a message, it's a puzzle. You need history, language, culture, and expert interpretation just to understand what it really means. So, instead of clarity, you get dependency. You're no longer reading the message. You're relying on someone else to explain it. And once that happens, the idea of a perfect message starts to fall apart. Because a perfect message should not require a middleman. If something is truly meant for all people, across all times, it should be understandable without needing a specialist to decode it. Think about basic instructions again. If a warning label says, "Do not touch, it's hot," you don't need a historian to explain what hot meant in ancient times. You don't need a linguist to break down the original language. You understand it instantly. That's what clarity looks like. Now compare that to religious texts that require centuries of commentary just to explain what a sentence might mean. That's not clarity. That's interpretation layered on interpretation. And here's the key issue. Once interpretation becomes necessary, disagreement becomes inevitable, because people don't interpret things the same way. They never have. They never will. So, if a message depends on interpretation, then confusion is built into the system. It's not an accident. It's a result. Now, let's look at how this plays out in real life. Take laws. Modern legal systems try to be as precise as possible. Even then, lawyers argue over wording. Courts debate meanings. Judges interpret intent. And this is with trained professionals working with updated language. Now imagine a text written thousands of years ago, translated multiple times, passed through different cultures, and read by billions of people with different backgrounds. And we're supposed to believe the meaning stays perfectly clear? That doesn't match reality. And when confusion shows up, it's not rare, it's constant. Let's take a simple example. Moral rules. Something that should be clear if it comes from a perfect source. But even here, interpretations differ. Some people read religious texts and conclude strict moral laws that never change. Others read the same texts and say morality evolves with time. Same message, opposite conclusions. Now bring this into modern society. You see people using the same religious text to argue for completely different positions. On gender roles, on freedom, on justice, on punishment. Each side claims they are following the true meaning. So, who's right? And more importantly, why isn't it obvious? If the message is perfect, you shouldn't need debates to figure out basic moral direction. It should be clear enough that disagreement is rare, not normal, but what we actually see is the opposite. Disagreement is the default. Agreement is the exception. Now, here's another common defense. Differences are small. The core message is the same. That sounds comforting, but it doesn't hold up, because the differences are not always small. They shape how people live, how they treat others, what they believe is right or wrong, even what they believe happens after death. These are not minor details. These are major claims, and if people can't agree on those, then the idea of a clear, perfect message becomes very hard to defend. Let's step outside religion for a moment. Look at science. When a concept is clearly explained and supported by evidence, people can test it, repeat it, verify it, and over time, agreement grows. There may be debates, but they shrink as understanding improves, because the system is built for clarity and correction. Now compare that to religious interpretation. Debates don't shrink, they multiply. New interpretations keep appearing. Old disagreements never fully disappear. And there's no clear way to test which interpretation is actually correct. So instead of moving toward clarity, the system keeps expanding in different directions. That's not what you expect from a perfect message. That's what you expect from something that is open-ended, flexible, unclear at its core. Now let's look at something even more direct: translation. Most people don't read religious texts in their original language. They read translations. And translation is not neutral. Words change, meanings shift, context gets lost or adjusted. So now you have a message that already needs interpretation, being filtered through different languages. Each version slightly different, each version influencing how people understand it. So the question becomes even sharper. If the message is perfect, why is it so dependent on imperfect translation? Why would a perfect message allow its meaning to shift based on language? Because now the meaning isn't fixed, it's fluid, and a fluid message can never be perfectly clear. Now let's make this even more personal. Imagine you're a person searching for truth. You pick up a religious text. You read it sincerely. You try to understand it. But then you find multiple interpretations, different scholars saying different things, different communities following different versions of the same belief. What are you supposed to do? How do you know which one is correct? You can't test it. You can't verify it independently. So you end up trusting authority, or tradition, or the group around you. But that means your belief isn't based on a clear message. It's based on which interpretation you were exposed to. And that's a very different thing, because now truth is not something clearly delivered. It's something filtered through people. And once that happens, the idea of a perfect message starts to look less like reality and more like an assumption people hold on to. Because if the message were truly perfect, you wouldn't need to rely on layers of human interpretation just to understand it. It would stand on its own, clear, direct, impossible to misunderstand in any major way. But that's not what we see. What we see is a system where meaning depends on who is reading, where they are, and what they've been taught. And once you notice that, the claim of perfection becomes harder to defend without ignoring the evidence right in front of you. Now, let's deal with the last escape route people usually take. They say, the message is clear enough. People just choose to disagree. That sounds confident. But it quietly shifts the problem again. Because now we're saying confusion isn't about ability. It's about intention. People could understand, but they don't want to. But look at reality. Most believers are sincere. They are not trying to twist the message. They genuinely think they understand it correctly. And yet, they still disagree with each other. Not just slightly, deeply. So, now you have a strange situation. Millions of sincere people reading the same message, trying to follow it honestly, and still reaching different conclusions. At that point, blaming intention stops making sense, because the pattern is too consistent. Now think about this from a design perspective. If you create a system where sincere users consistently reach different results, the problem is not just the users, it's the system. Let's bring this down to something simple again. Imagine an exam, same questions, same instructions, but half the students interpret the questions one way, and the other half interpret them completely differently, and both groups feel confident in their answers. Would you say the exam is perfectly designed, or would you say the questions are unclear? Because a well-designed question leads most people to the same understanding. That's the whole point. Clarity produces consistency. Confusion produces variation. Now, apply that to religious messages. We don't see consistency. We see variation on a massive scale, across time, cultures, and entire belief systems. And instead of questioning the clarity, people defend the idea of perfection. That's not a logical move. That's a protective one. Now here's where things get even more uncomfortable. If a message is unclear, people don't just disagree. They fill in the gaps. They bring their own assumptions, their culture, their biases, their desires. And slowly the message starts reflecting the reader more than the original source. That's why the same text can look strict in one culture and flexible in another, harsh in one group and compassionate in another. It's not because the message is changing, it's because interpretation is doing the work. And once interpretation takes over, the claim of a fixed perfect meaning becomes very difficult to maintain, because now meaning is being shaped, not just received. Let's look at history. Religious texts have been used to justify slavery. Later, the same texts were used to argue against it. Same source, opposite moral conclusions. At different times, people felt completely justified on both sides, not because they were evil, but because they believed their interpretation was correct. So again, the question becomes unavoidable. If the message is perfect, why does it allow for such extreme moral disagreement? A perfect moral message should reduce confusion about right and wrong, not create space for both sides to feel justified. Now, bring this into modern life. Today, people still argue over basic issues using the same religious texts: what roles people should have, how society should function, what is acceptable and what is not. And these are not small disagreements. They affect real lives, real decisions, real consequences. So, this isn't just a philosophical issue. It's practical. If the message were clear, these debates would be limited. But they're not. They keep happening, generation after generation. And each time, people think they've finally understood the true meaning, until the next disagreement appears. Now step back and look at the full picture. A perfect message should do a few simple things. It should be clear. It should be consistent. It should lead to similar understanding across different people. And it should not depend heavily on interpretation to avoid confusion. But what we actually see is the opposite. Unclear wording, multiple interpretations, endless disagreement, heavy reliance on scholars and tradition, and meaning that shifts depending on who is reading. So at some point you have to ask a very simple question. Is this what perfection looks like? Or are we calling something perfect because we believe it must be? Because once you remove that assumption, the pattern becomes easier to see. This is not how a perfect message behaves. This is how human communication behaves. Imperfect, context dependent, open to interpretation, shaped by culture and time, which leads to a final thought. If a message needs interpretation, translation, explanation, and constant debate just to be understood, then maybe the problem isn't that people are failing a perfect message. Maybe the message itself was never as perfect as it was claimed to be.